I'm Chris Fitzsimon with NC Policy Watch. Thanks for coming to our latest Crucial Conversation luncheon. Rob will introduce Tom Jensen to you in a couple of minutes, who really needs no introduction. But we thought this would be an interesting time just to get an idea. How many people have wandered around wondering, what are people thinking? So Tom Jensen is going to help us understand what people are thinking in a year that, thank goodness, Sarah Palin is back with us. But before we do that, and Rob introduces Tom, I just want to make sure everybody got a copy of Altered State, which is a report that we did at NC Policy Watch about the last 5 years of conservative rule in North Carolina and how it has changed the state, and we believe sent North Carolina in the wrong direction. We had a lot of, obviously the Policy Watch staff and reporters did the bulk of the work on this, but we'd love for you to help us get it out there, not only with a hard copy, but it's downloadable on our website. It really, I think, tells a story about how far North Carolina has slipped in a lot of things that made it a relatively progressive southern state up until 2011. So please help us distribute that. I always joke that we spent obviously several months working on this project, and at the end we all needed counseling sessions when you really catalog the damage that has been done. But you know, this is not a political event, and I think Rob will make that point. We're a 501c3 organization, and we don't care who's in office as long as they do the right thing. We believe there's been a lot of wrong things done, and the only answer for that really is to tell everybody about it. And I think people will make a lot better choices, not only in their leaders, but in the direction of North Carolina. So we'd love to have your help doing that, both at NC Policy Watch and the Justice Center. So thanks for coming. Please help us get this word out and this report out, and I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you all very much for coming. We're going to try and do without the microphone today, so Tom is free to move about. I do want to welcome our audience online. We'll be watching the event after it's been recorded on Periscope. We're trying that today for folks who want to watch via the Twitter feed. It's great to have such a big crowd. Everybody's here today. I was joking beforehand, but there's probably some truth to it, that it's, you know, when we have these dull and boring events on policy matters, it's like, oh boy, okay, another sad policy matter. But when it's politics and gossip and elections, then that turns people out. So this is an exciting event. We're delighted to have Tom Jensen with us today, who clearly is a progressive-leaning pollster and does a lot of work with Democrats. This is, however, a strictly nonpartisan event, as Chris alluded to. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we'll try to adhere to that today. But, of course, I do want to introduce Tom Jensen to you. For those of you who don't know him, obviously with the 2016 election right around the corner, the March primary is March 3rd is when early voting starts, so that's just a month away, just over a month away. Seems like an excellent time to catch up with where things stand. Tom is really, for those of you who don't know him, a treasure of our state, North Carolina treasure. He is the Director of Public Policy Polling and oversees its day-to-day operations. And during his time in public policy polling, he has been a frequent guest on television, radio stations across the country. He is widely acknowledged at a national level to be one of the most accurate and influential pollsters in our country. We're amazingly lucky to have him here in Raleigh. He works without props. There'll be no PowerPoint, no notes, but you'll find that he has an amazing amount of information to impart. We'll have time for questions afterwards. We'll let him get through his presentation, the good, bad, and the ugly of it. And so without further ado, let me introduce Tom Jensen. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you all for being here. I'm mostly going to focus on sort of what we're finding in North Carolina, but certainly in talking about the presidential race, I think it makes sense to sort of conceptualize North Carolina in the broader picture. So I'll kind of start out there. Believe it or not, we now are finally going to actually have some votes in 5 days in this presidential race that feels like it's been going on for years already. And in the Republican race, North Carolina has really been one of Donald Trump's strongest places right from the start. North Carolina was actually the very first place on July 8th, 6 months ago, where Donald Trump ever led a poll anywhere in the country. So we have the proud, dubious, whatever you want to call it, distinction of sort of being on the front line of Trump support. And when Trump first led that poll in North Carolina in July, he was doing it with 16% of the vote, really benefiting from an extremely fragmented Republican field to be able to lead in the state with only 16%. And what's been remarkable about Trump's support in North Carolina over the last 6 months is every single poll we've done since July, and we do a North Carolina poll every month, every single poll since July, Trump's support has been bigger than it was the month before. So when he had that lead in 16% in July, everybody was saying, oh, this is a temporary thing, this will quickly fall apart. Instead, he's just gone up, 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 up. And in our most recent poll, he's now close to almost 40% in North Carolina. He has over a 20-point lead over Ted Cruz, who's in second place at 16%. The only other Republican polling in double digits in North Carolina is Marco Rubio, and then everyone else is down in single digits. One finding that sort of encapsulates what a disappointment Jeb Bush's campaign has been is that he led North Carolina last spring, and when we polled North Carolina last week, he was tied with Mike Huckabee in North Carolina. You know, Mike Huckabee is in the kids' table debate, and Jeb Bush is tied with him here after having led here last spring. So North Carolina is a place that speaks pretty well to the struggles that Bush has had. So to sort of put North Carolina in the broader context and Trump getting stronger and stronger here, that's happening everywhere right now. He's getting stronger and stronger everywhere. And I think probably now the thing that's of most immediate interest to us is what's going on in Iowa for next week. The last couple polls we did in Iowa, one of them was a couple weeks before Christmas and one of them was a couple weeks ago. We found a very close race in Iowa between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. I think we had Trump up by a couple points on both of those polls. Cruz was leading the overall averages of all the polls. That's really changed over the last week and a half. Donald Trump has now emerged as the clear favorite in Iowa over the last 2 weeks. We started our very last Iowa poll last night. That will be out tomorrow, and it's still ongoing. We still have more people to interview, but it looks to me like we're going to have Donald Trump with a double-digit lead on our final poll in Iowa. And that's consistent with what a CNN poll last week found, what a Fox News poll out earlier this week found. And so you might wonder what's changed in the last 2 weeks that would all of a sudden turn Trump into this huge favorite in Iowa. I'm just going to tell you all, it's the Ted Cruz birther issue. The Ted Cruz being born in Canada thing that Trump has hammered is really cutting into Cruz's credibility with Iowa Republicans. As silly of an issue as I think it seems like to most reasonable people, that's really what we're finding, is that a majority of Republicans in Iowa say they think somebody born outside the U.S. should not be allowed to be president. And among that majority of voters that say somebody born outside the U.S. shouldn't be allowed to be president, Trump's leading Cruz like 50-4. So that's his entire margin of victory right there. And something that we had found a couple months ago that was sort of interesting was that there really was not a level of awareness about Cruz being born in Canada. In fact, we've repeatedly found that among Republican primary voters, for as much attention as Ted Cruz's birthplace has gotten in the last few weeks, there's still more Republicans who think that Ted Cruz was born in the U.S. than who think Barack Obama was born in the U.S. So that shows you sort of the electorate that you're working with here. But we were finding in Iowa earlier in the month, before this got so much attention, that a quarter of Cruz's supporters thought he was born in the U.S. and didn't realize this Canada thing, and that same quarter of supporters said they didn't think somebody born outside the U.S. should be allowed to be president. So as Trump has hit on this issue, it really is cutting into Cruz's credibility with his own base and sort of causing Trump to go up. And that sort of feeds into probably the most frequent question I get in the course of this job is, who are these people supporting Donald Trump? Why are these people supporting Donald Trump? That sort of thing. There's a lot of explanations you can put out there, but ultimately I think the biggest things driving Trump's support are racism and religious intolerance. Trump's out there saying things that people have thought, certainly for years, but there were things that you knew you weren't supposed to talk about in public. These were things that you were supposed to. These were things that you might think privately, but things that you knew. These aren't things you can talk about. These things aren't things you can be public about. And certainly these are things that no politician who's a serious candidate for office is going to get up there and sort of speak out the things that you think privately in public. And Trump's just completely exploded that dynamic. He just goes out and says all this totally extreme, off-the-wall stuff with no apologies for it, and that's why his supporters love him for it, and why they have been so true to him, and why his support has kept on increasing, is that as much heat as he's gotten from the media and that sort of thing for a lot of these positions, he's just held steadfast. So I'm going to tell you some specific metrics about what Trump supporters in North Carolina think. Trump's proposed Muslim database was so controversial, got, I think pretty much uniquely, universally panned by the establishment. But in North Carolina, 67% of Trump supporters favor a national database of Muslims. Only 14% are opposed to it. Universal support on that. Another thing Trump said at one point in this campaign was that he wanted to flat out close down the mosques in the United States. And we found in North Carolina, 51% of Trump supporters want to shut down the mosques in the United States. Only 16% say that's a really bad idea. We shouldn't shut down the mosques. We found, those are things Trump actually talked about. So sometimes Trump actually talks about things and we try to sort of anticipate the next thing he's going to say. So we polled his supporters on whether they even thought Islam should be legal at all in this country. And we found in North Carolina, only 24% of Trump supporters think Islam should even be legal. 44% think that it should be illegal. So that's sort of the extent of these anti-Muslim views that his supporters hold, and why they've been so loyal to him and gravitated to him, because he's gone out there and been so emphatic in talking about those things. We found that Trump supporters think Japanese internment was a good policy. We found that about 70% of of Trump supporters think that the president is a Muslim. Only 10% will acknowledge that he's a Christian. When you look at the Obama birther numbers just among Trump supporters, only like 20% of them will grant that President Obama was born in the United States. 60-70% will say that they think he was born in another country. So that's really where you're coming from with these Trump supporters, is they have all these racist views, all these Islamophobic views, and he's giving a voice to these people in a way that they've never had a voice before, and that's why he's doing so well. So those are all sort of very serious, unfortunate, scary-sounding findings. I'll tell you the one sort of funny finding along these lines is we asked Trump supporters, because he was going around after France and San Bernardino just talking about bombing everything. So we asked, we asked his people, would you support or oppose bombing Agrabah? Agrabah is the city in Aladdin. It's not a real place. By a 30-point margin, Trump supporters said they supported bombing Agrabah. So that sort of tells you the level of real knowledge that we're working with here. It's very much based on raw emotion. And the polls have consistently, repeatedly found that Trump support, the less educated somebody is, the higher Trump support is, and then as you get more and more and more educated, less and less likely to support Trump. But it's still certainly enough people to put him in the driver's seat. So I wouldn't stand up here and say there's a 100% chance that Trump's going to win Iowa, and there's a few reasons for that. Number one is that we're still finding in Iowa, even with the vote only 5 days away, that about half of voters say that they're open to changing their minds between now and the vote. That's sort of an interesting artifact, particularly of the Republican race. Democrats are a lot more dialed into who they're supporting. If you're for Clinton or Sanders right now, you're going to pretty much be for Clinton or Sanders next week. But on the Republican side, there's a lot more people who sort of say that they're open to changing their minds. And what's interesting is we look at the full field, but then we also will ask people on our polls, if you had to choose just between Trump and Cruz, who would you vote for? If you had to choose just between Trump and Cruz and Rubio, who would you vote for? And what we're finding in Iowa and across the board when we ask that is that supporters of every single candidate who's not Trump would prefer somebody other than Trump. Bush supporters want Cruz over Trump. Rubio supporters want Cruz over Trump. Fiorina, Huckabee, Christie, all of them, their supporters prefer Cruz over Trump. So where you have the potential for an upset in Iowa next week, I mean, I think at this point it's pretty safe to say, based on what's come out, that Trump's going to go into Election Day in Iowa with like a 6 or 7 point average lead over the spectrum of polls. But what could lead to a surprise is if the supporters of those lower tier candidates who have no chance at winning Iowa decide, okay, I'm going to abandon my first choice because I really want to stop Trump, and then they would move to Cruz over Trump if that was the choice they had to make. So that's the sort of the world in which I could see Cruz still winning Iowa, is if a lot of strategic voting goes on where people abandon who they're with right now to stop Trump. But unless that happens, it looks like Trump's pretty well positioned in Iowa. And then Iowa is actually about Trump's weakest state. You get ahead to New Hampshire, Trump's consistently up 20, 25 points in the polls. You get to South Carolina, Trump's consistently up 20, 25 points in the polls. So what I had felt like about this race for a long time was that if the Republicans were going to stop Trump, Iowa was the place to do it. If Trump loses Iowa, maybe he loses some of the shine off his campaign. I think a lot of what appeals to his supporters is that he's a winner and he has that veneer of being a winner, so if he loses something, maybe he gets kicked off that. But at this point, I don't know that he actually is going to lose Iowa. I think he's probably going to win. And, he's out there saying, if I win Iowa, I'm going to win everything. He might be right about that because he has much more substantial leads in the states following Iowa than he does Iowa. So that's kind of the big picture on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, North Carolina is very different from sort of the picture in Iowa and New Hampshire in an interesting way. Our most recent poll, we found Hillary Clinton leading Bernie Sanders by 33 points in North Carolina, which might seem a little bit surprising because it's so close in Iowa and Sanders seems to have a definite advantage in New Hampshire. But there's a huge racial disparity in terms of what's sort of going on with the Democratic primary. White voters are pretty evenly divided between Clinton and Sanders, but then when you look at African Americans and Latinos, there's a very strong favoring of Hillary Clinton. So the primary calendar works in a way that's very beneficial to Bernie Sanders because Iowa and New Hampshire have basically the two whitest Democratic primary electorates in the country. So those first two contests that get so much attention, the demographics really play well in Bernie Sanders' direction. But the reason Hillary Clinton's up by 31 in North Carolina is that she's at about 80% with African Americans, and Bernie Sanders is only at about 10% with African Americans. So you think about the fact that African Americans are about 35% of the Democratic primary electorate in North Carolina. Hillary Clinton basically has a 70-point lead with them. That gives Hillary Clinton a 25-point lead in North Carolina right off the bat, just based on that strength with African American voters. And it's a similar story in South Carolina, which will be the fourth Democratic contest. And then along with us in March, that first few weeks of March, you have a lot of southern states that have very heavy African American Democratic primary electorates. In Florida and Texas, you have very heavy Latino Democratic primary electorates. Even if Bernie Sanders ends up winning both Iowa and New Hampshire, because of Hillary Clinton's strong structural advantage with non-white voters in the states that sort of follow Iowa and New Hampshire, I still think she'll be the overwhelming favorite to win the Democratic nomination, even if she loses both Iowa and New Hampshire. And I don't think she is going to lose both Iowa and New Hampshire. Along with starting our last Republican poll in Iowa last night, we also started our last Democratic poll. It looks to me like Hillary Clinton's up by about 10 points in Iowa over Bernie Sanders. One thing that's a really interesting dynamic in Iowa, and I think it'll be an interesting dynamic in New Hampshire too, is that the polls are consistently showing that among people who have participated in Democratic primary or caucus elections in the past, in Iowa for instance, Hillary Clinton has like a 25-point lead. But among people who are planning to caucus or vote in a primary for the first time, Bernie has about a 50-point lead. So he's really relying on sort of people turning out for the first time in order for his campaign to be successful. And that worked out for Barack Obama in 2008. So it's not something that should be dismissed out of hand. But when Iowa votes next week, we'll start to get the sense of whether Bernie Sanders really is able to bring all those people brand new into the electorate, or if that was sort of a one-time phenomenon for Iowa. Because you don't often have a dynamic where somebody's able to win an election by turning out a huge number of people who don't usually vote and that kind of thing. And when we talk about people who've never voted in a caucus before, for Bernie to win Iowa, he's having to turn out a lot of people who didn't even bother to go vote in 2008 when it was Clinton and Obama and Edwards and that kind of thing. So you're talking about people who were either too young to vote then or people who didn't find any of those candidates compelling enough to go caucus for. So my sense is that in Iowa, Hillary Clinton's probably going to end up outperforming the polls because of that dynamic, because I think the sort of assumptions that Sanders doing well is based on are maybe asking for a lot, but it's the kind of thing where everything is sort of speculative at this point, and we'll see how it actually plays out in real life. Finally, all we pollsters are very glad to finally get an actual test of whether everything we've been saying for a couple of years is right or not. Then moving on to New Hampshire, it does seem like Bernie has a pretty substantial lead there at this point. So I think he'll probably win New Hampshire. I think Hillary will probably win Iowa, and then I think Hillary will probably win most of the places moving forward after that first set of Iowa and New Hampshire. But even though he's not likely to win the nomination, I think that Bernie Sanders has certainly played a great role in this campaign. I know that some Democrats are sort of think that the contested primary is a bad thing, but I think that it's helped to make everybody sort of get going earlier and get their whole team set up and sort of have a dry run for all the campaigning you're going to have to go through at the state level in the fall. And I do think that the issues that Bernie Sanders has brought to the fore have sort of led to a more robust discussion and put important things on the table and all that sort of thing. So I understand why conservatives are all so mad at each other because they might nominate somebody who's kind of crazy. But I think that progressives, I think progressives really should just be glad to have the choices they have and not have to fight with each other the way the conservatives are. So that's my 2 cents on that. Now, I have to be very honest about the general election, though. This is something that Chris and I talked about last week, and I think a lot of people are sort of surprised by this. I think a lot of people, especially in the progressive community, are sort of walking around with the assumption that if the Republicans do nominate Ted Cruz or Donald Trump, that this is going to be a huge Democratic year, and Democrats are going to, get a blowout victory in the presidential race that's then going to lead to winning lots of Senate races and congressional races and all that kind of thing. And I really don't think that's true based on what we're seeing in the polls right now. Nationally, right now, we have Hillary Clinton up by 2 or 3 points on Ted Cruz and Donald Trump head-to-head. So you're looking at a presidential race that is at least as close, if not closer, than the presidential race in 2012 was, where even though it ended up being a pretty solid electoral college victory for President Obama, it was certainly, for his supporters, stressful right down to the end. So what we're finding at the national level is a very close race. What we're finding in most swing states is a very close race. One interesting thing I should point out, and this is why the Republican establishment is being driven so crazy by Trump and Cruz doing so well, is everywhere we poll, we find that Marco Rubio would be the strongest Republican candidate in the general election. Our last national poll, Rubio was the only Republican who led Hillary Clinton head-to-head. And then in most of our individual state polls, we find that he does the best. But at this point, he just doesn't have the support in the Republican primary to be the nominee. So what we're seeing in North Carolina on the presidential race is something really kind of in between what we had in 2008 and 2012 when we were one of the closest states in the country, and then 2004 when we were a Republican blowout. We find that all the Republicans lead Hillary Clinton in North Carolina, and that includes Cruz and Trump. But it's close. Clinton trails the Republicans by anywhere from 1 to 5 points. Rubio's the one who leads Clinton by 5, and then Trump's the one who only leads Clinton by 1. So an easier matchup for Democrats, but still not an easy matchup for Democrats. My sense is that we're going to be pretty similar to what we were in 2008 and 2012, where we're sort of a second-tier swing state. We may be one of the closer states in the country, but we're probably not going to be the state that pushes somebody to 270 electoral votes or not. In 2008, when Barack Obama won the state, it was like his 365th electoral vote or something like that. So it was sort of like icing on top of the cake. And then when he narrowly lost it in 2012, it was a situation where it would have been nice to have it, but he was in a very comfortable position overall already. So the reason that it's competitive, even if it's Cruz or Trump, is that, I mean, Hillary Clinton is very unpopular. About 35% of voters have a favorable opinion of her. About 55% have an unfavorable opinion of her. And it's the same for Trump and Cruz. We're really heading towards a presidential election between two people, whoever ends up emerging, who are deeply unpopular. This will be, in the history of American polling anyway, I can't speak to like 1876 or whatever, but in the history of American polling, we'll have the most unpopular presidential candidates we've ever had this year. And what's interesting about that, I've always said over the years, well, people really dislike both of these people, so that really opens the door for a third party candidate. But what's interesting is that as we've gotten so polarized, the door's not really open for a third-party candidate. Michael Bloomberg's obviously gotten a lot of attention over the last week about possibly running. We actually tested him in North Carolina last month. He got 10%, but that's still not, I mean, and that's more than a third-party candidate would usually get. But when you think about Clinton and Trump both being so unpopular, 10% is really not that robust a level of support. And we tested on a national poll last month, just a generic independent candidate. So, you know, basically saying, if you don't like Clinton and you don't like Trump, would you be open to any sort of third option? Which I thought this was something that would poll at like 25 or 30%, because you're basically testing like, you know, neutral Jesus or something like that. And even that only got 13%. So the door is not really that open to a third-party candidate, which is interesting to me, but it speaks to the reality of Democrats being so ingrained in voting Democratic, Republicans being so ingrained in voting Republican, and even though the number of independents is increasing, you still have a situation where most of them usually vote Democratic or usually vote Republican. To put Bloomberg's 10% into perspective, I saw some people in the media being like, wow, this is impressive, Bloomberg got 10%. We also tested D's nuts on the poll, he got 10% too. So there's the same level of hankering for a D's nuts candidacy as one of the richest people in America. We also tested another pair of candidates. Jim Webb, you know, was very frustrated that Democratic primary voters didn't find it compelling that he killed a man, so he's talking about running as a third-party candidate. We found that he got 7%. Also getting 7% as a third-party candidate was Bug the Cat, which is a friend of mine who works for the Sierra Club that I ride the buses with, Cat, that he wanted me to test in a poll, and he has the same level of support as the former senator from Virginia. So not a ton of support for a third-party candidate. So that's sort of the presidential race, and then I'll quickly run through some of the state stuff and then take all your questions. The governor's race has been incredibly consistent in our polling over the last few years. And this is really the dynamic we have is Governor McCrory's unpopular. He first became unpopular during the big Moral Monday summer. I remember the first poll where we ever had Governor McCrory with a negative approval rating was in July of 2013. And he's continued to have a negative approval rating every single month since July of 2013. He's now running on 30 consecutive months of being unpopular. That actually still puts him a step ahead of Governor Perdue, who first went negative in April of her first year in office and stayed negative throughout the entire rest of the time. So North Carolina has now had a negative opinion of its governor for 75 out of the last 81 months. We're either a tough audience or we need better governors or something. So we've consistently found Governor McCrory to be pretty unpopular. He has about a 35% approval rating, about a 45% disapproval rating, and this is a situation where if we'd been talking 15 or 20 years ago, we'd say, okay, he has a 35% approval rating, he's done. Roy Cooper is going to be the next governor. Because it used to be that if you had a negative approval rating, it really meant that you were sort of out of contention. But we have to sort of change the curve by which we measure politician approval ratings. If you have a 50% approval rating now, which sort of used to be the measure of being decent, if you have a 50% approval rating now as a governor or a senator, that puts you in like the 90th percentile of popularity, because this whole country is so frustrated with politicians, so down on politicians. There's very few people who have very high approval ratings. So McCrory can still get reelected with a 35% approval rating, because one dynamic that's interesting with his numbers is he only has about a 60% approval rating with Republicans. There's a lot of Republicans who don't like Governor McCrory, but if it comes to a general election, they're going to vote for him anyway. So that's how you get from having a 35% approval rating to potentially getting the 48-49% of the vote that you need to win or whatever. So McCrory's unpopular. The situation with Roy Cooper that I know is very surprised to all of us in the room who are so politically engaged is that most North Carolinians just don't know who he is. Even after 15 years as Attorney General, we tend to find that about 50% of voters have no opinion about Cooper one way or the other. He has pretty decent numbers among those who do. We usually find about 30% see him favorably, 20% unfavorably, which is a good ratio in this day and age, but it really speaks to the extent to which the Council of State doesn't exactly draw your average voter's attention. And his name recognition, I think, was a lot higher 10 years ago in the wake of the Duke lacrosse case, but there hasn't been something like that that's put him that prominently in the spotlight since then. So basically what we have is a situation where voters are open to replacing Governor McCrory, but they just don't know yet if they think Roy Cooper is a better alternative or not. So what that's equated to in all of the polls that we do is really a 50-50 race. We basically just about flip back and forth on a month-by-month basis whether Cooper's ahead or whether McCrory's ahead, but it's always by 2 or 3 points. Our most recent poll had Cooper up 43-40, but in December we had McCrory up by a few points. So I just, anytime, like, last week we had Cooper up, and if somebody asked me who's winning, I'd just say it's a tie, and I'd say that if McCrory was up by a few points too. That's just the way to think about it, because it's so close. And this really will be the premier governor's race in the country this year. We're the biggest state that has a governor's race, I think, period, and certainly the biggest state that has such a competitive governor's race. So if we all enjoyed Hagan and Tillis and $100 million of independent attack ads in 2014, I'm not sure we're headed for something exactly on that level, but I think we're headed for something in sort of that kind of ballpark that we can all look forward to. And really sort of the overall picture of how McCrory went from winning by 12 points in 2012, which is quite impressive in such a closely divided state, to now being in this 50-50 situation is there were two dynamics McCrory had going for him in 2012 that just aren't the case anymore. He really did have a lot of Democrats, particularly in the Charlotte area in 2012, who thought that he was a different kind of Republican and voted for him because of that. We found that he got about 25-30% of the Democratic vote in 2012. Now he's down at 10-15% of the Democratic vote. Those Democrats who voted for McCrory in 2012 after seeing him in office have come to the conclusion that he's not a different kind of Republican. He's just the same as all the other kinds of Republicans. So most of that Democratic support that he got last time around is not going to be present again this time. And we also had a situation in 2012 where McCrory won independents 2-1. You usually think of independents as being pretty closely split between the two parties, and that was not the case last time around. Governor McCrory really dominated with them. We still find him leading with independents on most of our polls, but it's by like 10 or 15 points instead of 30 or 35 points. So he still has the Republican base behind him, but that overwhelming support from independents is gone, and the crossover support from Democrats is gone, and that gets us back to really a 50-50 sort of race. So that's the governor's race. The U.S. Senate race, I think, is really unpredictable, just based on however the presidential election ends up shaking out and the overall national political climate. Richard Burr is definitely not very popular and really not very well known. It's hard to find another senator in the country who's been in office for over 10 years who has so few voters who have an opinion about them. What we find about Burr, really time after time after time, is about a third of voters in the state approve of him, About a third of voters in the state disapprove of him, and about a third of voters in the state don't have an opinion about him one way or the other, which is a really high percentage to have with no opinion about you after you've been through 2 Senate campaigns. So he's certainly theoretically vulnerable based on those approval numbers. It's just a situation right now where there's a good Democratic field, but the candidates aren't well known yet. None of the Democratic candidates have more than about 25% statewide name recognition. We've consistently found Deborah Ross leading the primary. I think she's the definite favorite there, although there's a lot of undecided voters that could sort of make it a little more unpredictable. But what we found is that Burr's usually up by an average of about 7 to 10 points against the possible Democratic candidates. And again, there's definitely a part of that that's a name recognition deficit. You have a situation where Democrats are a lot more likely to be undecided than Republicans are because Democrats just don't know the candidates yet. And what the polling situation is actually very reminiscent of is the 2008 Senate election, where if we'd been talking in January of 2008, I would have talked about how Elizabeth Dole leads Kay Hagan by 10, 15 points because Kay Hagan's not very well known yet. And what we saw from that is that if the political climate's right, if you do a good job of sort of bringing the incumbent to account, and if you run a really solid campaign, you can turn a 10, 15 point deficit at this stage in January into a victory by November. But it really is a situation where it'll just depend on the presidential race. If Hillary Clinton loses North Carolina by 6 or 7 points, Richard Burr and Pat McCrory are probably going to get reelected. If it's more like a 1 or 2 point race in the presidential race in North Carolina, then Roy Cooper and whoever the Democratic candidate for Senate ends up being are going to have, I think, a pretty decent shot. It's sort of one unfortunate thing about how politics has sort of changed in this state over the last few years. As you all know, we used to have a real habit of ticket splitting where we voted Republican at the national level, but we would think about the state races in a different sort of way, and we're much more open to voting Democratic at the state level. And now that's all become sort of much more partisan across the board. So when people ask me what's the biggest factor that's going to determine the governor's race and that sort of thing, the biggest factor that's going to determine the governor's race is the presidential race. It has nothing to do with anything that's happened in Raleigh over the last 3 years. Well, I shouldn't say it has nothing to do, but it will be the biggest factor. Just as we saw in the Senate race in 2014, North Carolinians don't like Tom Tillis. We just found on our like 1 year anniversary of Tom Tillis in the U.S. Senate that he has a 22% approval rating. He might be the least popular senator in the entire country. But people voted for Tom Tillis to vote against Barack Obama. It didn't matter what Tillis had done in the General Assembly and that sort of thing. When that was such a close race the whole year, what ended up tipping the scales to Tillis, I think our last poll had something like 7% of voters undecided. And among that 7% that was undecided, something like 80% disapproved of President Obama. So they ended up voting for Tillis over Hagan as a reflection of their feelings on the president, and really had very little to do with the actual candidates here at all. So that national climate will have a huge impact. And you know, it's been a very interesting shift in this state over the last 10 years where federal elections that used to be much more solidly Republican have gotten much more competitive at the state level, but then state elections that used to be much more Democratic have gotten much more favorable to Republicans. And the dynamic that's led to the increased competitiveness in federal elections for Senate and the president and stuff like that, and this is going to continue, is that all the demographic trends that are occurring in this state are sort of favorable to Democrats. You're seeing a situation in every election where a smaller share of the electorate's white, a larger share of the electorate is certainly every single election for the rest of time is going to have a record level of Latino turnout in North Carolina, which tends to benefit Democrats, but also African American turnout as a function of the overall electorate is definitely higher than it used to be. So those dynamics help Democrats. There's a big generational divide in the state. The strongest Republican voters are seniors, the strongest Democratic voters are younger voters, so that sort of generational shift in the electorate has helped to make North Carolina much more competitive at the federal level. And then we also have a situation where the population is increasingly less rural, more urban and suburban. Rural voters tend to vote more Republican, urban, suburban voters tend to vote more Democratic. So all those sorts of shifts that are happening in the population are making it more possible for Democrats to win a Senate race, Democrats to win a presidential race, that sort of thing. But then you just have this concurrent dynamic where people think about state races the same way that they think about federal races, which makes it harder for Democrats to win over all those sort of ticket splitters that they used to have. So those are just some broader trends. And then just to walk through a few final things before getting to questions. The General Assembly is very unpopular, 17% approval rating. It's almost as unpopular as Congress. So usually when I talk about that, people assume that that means that Democrats have a good shot for making gains this fall. But what we find is that even though people really dislike the General Assembly, they don't think of it as being the Republicans' fault. They just dislike the whole thing. So Democrats and Republicans in the General Assembly as separate entities, we tend to find have the same approval ratings, about 30% like the Democrats in the legislature, about 30% like the Republicans in the legislature. So even though the Republicans are in charge, they're not really sort of getting the blame. So what we find when we ask people, how would you vote if there was an election for the legislature today, is evenly divided between people saying they'd vote for a Democrat and voting for a Republican. And as you know, in our heavily gerrymandered state, if we vote 50-50, that means the Republicans win 60% of the seats. So based on the current sort of statewide situation, it's hard to exactly extrapolate that to districts, but you have a situation where next year you're not likely to see a terribly different sort of breakdown of legislative composition from what you have right now. Democrats, I think, have some great chances to pick up some seats, particularly in Wake County, but then there's also the possibility of losing some of the ones they picked up in 2014 and that sort of thing. So I doubt you would see a shift of more than a few seats one way or the other. So I feel like this overall talk has been sort of neutral to a little pessimistic for progressives, so I'm going to talk about some happy things. North Carolinians really are more progressive on some of the key issues that we poll around everywhere in the country than you might expect. 70% of North Carolinians want the minimum wage increased to at least $10 an hour. And I know a lot of us in the progressive community would prefer to see a $12 minimum wage or a $15 minimum wage or something like that. Where the public is comfortable right now is generally $10, but there's very strong support for that. One thing that's particularly notable is we find that almost 60% of Republicans in North Carolina want to increase the minimum wage to at least $10 an hour. It's a situation where not one of the 12 Republican presidential candidates will really talk about raising the minimum wage at all. But then when you get to the actual Republican Party base, 60% think you need to go up to at least $10 an hour. So that's really an issue where I think voters are on the side of progressives. We continue to find strong support for Medicaid expansion in North Carolina. About 60% of voters support expanding Medicaid. Only about 35% are opposed to it. And that's consistent with what we find in other states with Republican governors. Medicaid expansion really is something that is pretty popular across the board, and we'll see if progressives are able to more turn that into sort of an electoral issue this year. Background checks on all gun purchases is something that we find over 80% support for in North Carolina, and almost no division along partisan lines at all. About 90% of Democrats we usually find in support, 85% of independents, 80% of Republicans. So that's really a common sense sort of thing that we see voters agreeing on across the board. And then the EPA Clean Power Plan, we find about 65% of voters in North Carolina support that. Only about 30% opposed. So there are a lot of issues where I think the voters are much more aligned with progressives than conservatives. There's obviously just some structural disadvantages that progressives have in this state with the money infrastructure, conservatives having a lot more money, and certainly these districts that make it harder for progressives to compete. But we do have a lot of good issues to work with where the public is very much on our side. And I'll close with some numbers about football. should all be very interested in North Carolina right now. And if this room is any indication, a quarter more of us are Panthers fans than were a year ago at this time. We did a poll in December of 2014 when the Panthers were 3-8, and we found that 34% of voters in the state said that they were Panthers fans. And now we're going to the Super Bowl, and we find that all of a sudden 60% of voters are Panthers fans. So I've never been able to measure the growth of a bandwagon quite to that extent, but I think it's great to see the state unified around something. What we have a knack for at PPP, though, is even making fun things like sports a little bit political. We also asked on this poll, who's your favorite player for the Panthers, Cam Newton or Luke Kuechly? And we found that among Democrats, Cam Newton's their favorite by 25 points. And we found among Republicans that Luke Kuechly's their favorite by about 10 points. And I'll leave the interpretation on that to you. So anyway, thank you all again for being here. I'm glad to take any questions.
I want to say, first of all, I'm gonna be the MC. I know we'll have a lot of questions. First of all, you can check out all of his stuff at publicpolicypolling.com. Go to his website. He puts up all the crosstabs, all the details of who's being interviewed, how many people are being interviewed, all the demographic breakdowns. It's really just a wellspring of information. So do check that out. I get to ask the first question, though, I guess, because I'm the moderator. Have you ever seen? This spiral you talk about in public attitudes, this sort of cynicism that seems to be growing. And so, have we ever seen that turn around? Can you ever point to a place or a state where maybe there was a turnaround, or where a legislative body became more popular, or people were less down on a group? Is there any precedent for that, or we're just going to have to make that up as we go along?
Well, we really are at sort of. So we're at record low levels of approval for Congress, record low levels of approval for the legislature, record low approvals for most individual politicians. So there's a part of me that feels like there's nowhere to go but up. But I don't know that to be the case. I think North Carolina is a good example of how sort of just disenchanted voters are across the board. We had a situation where Governor Perdue, whether it was fair or unfair, was very unpopular her entire time in office, and people were so happy to get someone new in, and then they didn't like him anymore after 6 months either. Now, we might agree with why they didn't like him anymore after 6 months, but it is a situation where it's just very hard to keep voters happy, and it's particularly hard to keep voters happy in larger states like North Carolina. When we do find politicians to be popular, it tends to be in the Vermonts and Wyomings and those sort of places of the world. Smaller states where there's a lot fewer voters that you have to sort of keep in touch with and that sort of thing and maintain that personal contact with. But to be very honest, I sort of think that we just as a society are very sort of restless and disenchanted, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Got our work cut out for us. All right, I'm going to go around. I'm going to start over here. We're going to use the microphone just so that nobody will be under pressure to shout, and it also gives me a chance to control everything.
Thanks a lot. This is apropos to your statement about this, the general election looking like it may be two very unpopular or relatively unpopular candidates against each other. Do you see? Do you see any difference amongst Republicans and Democrats as to a willingness to sort of hold their nose and go ahead and vote for the party's candidate, even though they have supported in the primaries the other one? And secondly, do you see any evidence that among Trump supporters, they want to make a statement that they're unhappy with the direction the country's going, but when they actually have to face the fact that Donald Trump could become president of the United States, then maybe they become less strong in their support or decide to stay home?
Sure. Those are both great questions. I think that the Democrats are more likely to be unified in the end than the Republicans. What we've pretty consistently found among Democratic primary electorate voters is that if you like Bernie Sanders, you also like Hillary Clinton. If you like Hillary Clinton, you also like Bernie Sanders. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are both more popular with Democrats than any of the Republican candidates are with Republicans individually. So, I mean, I see every day on the internet like people I like sniping at each other about Clinton and Sanders and that sort of thing, but ultimately that's a pretty limited segment of the Democrat electorate that really dislikes either of them. So I think it'll be pretty easy for Democrats to unify. On the other hand, we do find that like Bush and Christie and Kasich supporters and that kind of thing dislike Trump. I do think most of them will end up holding their nose, but my sense of how things really would play out if it ends up being Clinton versus Trump is that Clinton probably does end up winning by 4 or 5 points, something like that, and I think a big piece of her being able to end up winning was that she will have a more unified party than he will. Your second question goes right into my head, because what I've been saying, or really what I was saying from like July to December is, you know, Trump's up right now, but I think when it actually gets time for people to vote and they really have to think about, do I want this guy to have control of the bomb and that sort of thing, people will get cold feet and end up not voting for him. What we're actually finding is that it gets closer, he's getting stronger, so my assumption about that may have been incorrect. And it's something I think we're really only going to get an answer for when people actually start voting. I mean, obviously people are feeling as comfortable as ever telling pollsters they're going to vote for Trump. Whether when they actually get in that caucus site on Monday night or the voting booth in New Hampshire in a couple weeks and are really willing to go through with that, I mean, that's what's really fascinating right now, I think, is to see if that actually happens or not. So I totally agree with your line of thinking that I'm skeptical that when people actually have to vote that they'll think about it the same way, but there hasn't really been any evidence yet that they are ready to go a different direction.
I noted in a tweet the other day that John Hood, the head of the John Locke Foundation, the arch conservative group we often do battle with, referred to the Donald Trump crisis. It's an interesting phenomenon. Some on the right would see his emergence. Excuse me. Okay, you go next because you're right here.
I just wanted to follow up on this question.
Sure.
Are you finding that the Trump supporters, are they people who vote all the time?
Well, that is another very good question, is that Trump has much stronger support among people who don't have a big history of voting. He doesn't do as well with your sort of typical Republican primary voters. So that's one of the big questions for both Sanders and Trump over the next few weeks, is that they're each sort of depending on people who aren't as traditional voters for them to be as successful as they're polling, and we'll have to see if it happens or not. And there's definitely a lot of skepticism about Donald Trump's field program, whether he actually has the campaign infrastructure to turn out all these people who say that they're for him, or if they're just sort of depending on them to get themselves out. There's a lot of sort of debate about whether he actually has a real field program that would be able to turn those folks out or not. But that's another good point, is that he is depending on people who are not your real regular voters.
Over here.
Thanks. I'm going down the same road a little bit more in that polling. What are you finding for crossover Democrats going for Trump, and also are they new voters or not regular voters?
Sure. We're really not finding a ton of crossover on all this sort of stuff. We find that maybe 10% of Democrats would support Trump, but 10% of Republicans would support Clinton or Sanders as well. So not a ton there, and it's sort of an interesting situation where the Democrats who do say they would vote for Trump, I think it's the same sort of Democrats who would have voted for Romney and would have voted for Bush and that sort of thing. You're sort of ancestral Southern Democrats. I mean, we did one poll. We've been doing some polls in Kentucky legislative districts, and Kentucky has more Democrats who aren't really Democrats than anywhere in the country. And we'll find there that as many as like 40% of Democrats say they support Trump. But it's not because you have Trump just having all these people who are solid Democratic voters falling in love with him. Those people just never vote Democratic, even though they're registered that way.
In the General Assembly, I've read that the number of senators and legislatures have chosen not to seek re-election, and that the number of seats are uncontested. Will that impact primarily the primaries, or will that also have an impact on the general election?
Sure. I mean, the reality is that the seats that are uncontested for the general election would not be competitive even if somebody did contest them. So it sort of speaks to our bigger picture, small d democracy problem, where we have the districts drawn in such ways that, you know, a lot of districts, there's just no point for a Democrat to file against in a 80% Republican district, or there's no point for a Republican to file in an 80% Democratic district. So I think that the Democrats in particular did a good job this year of making sure that they have serious candidates for all the seats that they could plausibly win. There's just not that many seats that they could plausibly win because of the way that the lines are drawn up. And that actually, it's a great question because it leads me to a broader point. We have strong bipartisan support in this state for creating a nonpartisan redistricting process. That's something where we find about 65% of voters are in favor of it. Only like 10% are opposed to it. And one thing that's particularly remarkable about those numbers is that there's almost no division along party lines. Democrats, Republicans, independents alike all really think that we should have a nonpartisan redistricting process to create more competitive seats and things like that. I think a lot of people maybe sort of would have assumed after the Republicans got control of everything that they would not continue to support nonpartisan redistricting, and that has proven to be the case with Republican politicians who used to really want nonpartisan redistricting. They're not so much about that anymore, but actual Republican voters still very much think that we should have nonpartisan redistricting and create a fair process so we have fewer seats like you're talking about that are uncontested.
Here in the back, and then we're going to go here. We're working our way around. We got time.
Did you any trying to predict the impact of movements like Raise Up for 15, which are really trying to get out and register and then encouraged to go to the polls? Those people who don't vote primarily because they are convinced that their vote doesn't matter. Are you finding anything about those kind of grassroots programs?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you that those kind of people who tend to be less engaged and have trouble voting or are less inclined to vote don't really answer polls either. So I don't have, it's not something I can frankly say that I have a lot of data about, but I think that certainly efforts like that are very important because you exactly speak to the fact that if there's not a real concerted grassroots effort to get people like that engaged, they're not going to get engaged on their own. So that, I think, is very important work that's being done.
A question over here, I think.
Hello, I have to apologize. I haven't been keeping up very closely with all of this election, so I apologize for the terminology. It seems like when I heard when Donald Trump, when he first started to run, he said something like, I'm very dissatisfied with the entire system. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to me, I felt instinctually that held on the public in general. It really captured their imagination about this dissatisfaction that the whole thing is corrupt.
Yep.
And so, because that was the first impression, it just locked on. And I would call it the Trump effect, where whatever he said that first moment, it just trumped everything else.
Yes.
So, because of that, there's no logic involved. So that was my thought about it. I wanted to know what you thought about that, what I said.
I have described Trump supporters as really like being a cult, where anything he says, his supporters will just buy into it, even if it's something that they really haven't thought about before. I think the best example of that was Trump was going around a lot in November talking about how there's video of thousands of Arabs in New Jersey cheering on 9/11, and when we would poll on it, like 70% of his supporters would say, yeah, there were thousands of Arabs cheering in New Jersey on 9/11. It's not true. It's just not true at all. But Trump, because he has played so well into that anger that you're talking about, has played so well into that anger, he's sort of created a situation where, you know, if he says jump, his supporters jump, even if it's something that they really haven't thought before, because he's sort of established that credibility with them as being somebody who's really against the current system and that sort of thing, and it's been effective for him. And I think that's why he's also been able to get away with sort of saying some things that maybe would be considered to be more on the liberal side of the spectrum, is because he's just earned so much credibility with his supporters with sort of the big picture stuff. I mean, one thing that's really interesting with Trump is that a lot of what he says about money in politics, even though it's disingenuous because it's coming from the stance of being a billionaire, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff he says sort of would resonate some with progressive voters about campaign finance and people being bought by special interests and that sort of thing. And I think that's why he's doing so well with voters who have some of the concerns about the system being so unfair that we share in the progressive community, because it's just sort of feeding into that general unhappiness.
Question in the back.
Hello, thank you so much for the polling that you've done. My name is Lindy Brown, former Wake County Commissioner. Can you tell me if you have done a polling on the bond referendum that's coming up for primary?
We actually have not done any polling on the bond yet. My understanding from other stuff that I've seen is that it starts out sort of generally popular, but people really just don't know that much about it yet. And certainly I think you're going to have a situation over the next couple months where there's going to be a lot of money spent on it both ways to sort of try to influence people. So I think of the situation with the bond right now as being pretty much unformed. It's something where I think you'll have a lot of voters make up their mind for real about it in the last few weeks of the campaign, once it starts to really sort of reach people's level of attention.
Angela's got a question here.
Hey Tom, can you speak more to African American turnout in North Carolina, and specifically African American women and their turnout as far as the potential impact on the races?
Sure. Well, a dynamic that's a great question, because it leads to something that was really important about the 2014 election in North Carolina. We obviously saw great African American turnout in 2008 and 2012, but a lot of people will say, well, that was just because of President Obama, and that was a one-time phenomenon that will never be repeated. African American turnout in 2014 in this state was about the same as white turnout, and I think what that speaks to is the engagement that President Obama was able to create about voting within the African American community is something that I think it's become a permanent thing, and we will see much higher levels of black turnout moving forward than we ever did before. In 2004, the John Kerry, George W. Bush election, only 18% of the vote in North Carolina was African American. We almost always historically have seen higher African American turnout in presidential years than midterms. So to go from 18% African American vote in 2004 to 22% African American turnout in 2014 without a presidential race, I think really speaks to, I think it is a new reality that I think we're going to see a permanent increase in African American engagement, and African American women particularly have higher levels of turnout. Well, women have higher levels of turnout than men across the board. That's particularly true in the African American community. So African American voters, and especially African American females, are demographics that everyone should be paying a lot of attention to.
A couple more questions, and all right.
Thank you. Tom, have you got any data on how the I-77 toll lanes are going to affect McCrory's campaign?
Sure. We haven't done any statewide polling on it, but we've polled about it in Mecklenburg County, and particularly in Charles Jeter's legislative district. And it's an amazing issue where you see like 80% opposition to the plan. It's very unusual for us to have something like that, where you'll see not just 80% opposition overall, but you'll see 80% of Democrats and 80% of Republicans and 80% of independents all opposed to it. So I think that that's giving Democrats some very good chances to pick up some legislative seats in Mecklenburg County, specifically based on local issues, which you don't see so much in sort of state level elections. But this is an issue that really breaks away from the pack in terms of sort of its impact, because the level of anger is so high and so bipartisan.
We're going to go to Tom Rhodes and then Rose Hoban over there. Tom?
I have a question about methodology. It's become much more difficult to get response to surveys these days, and there are many more platforms for surveys, whether it's landlines, cell phones, internet, in person. Do you find that there is much variation across the platforms when you are surveying for a given question?
Sure. That's a really good question. And what we find is that, let's say you get a 35-year-old African American on the internet, or you get a 35-year-old African American on the phone, you're not going to find differences within the same groups, but there's different demographics that are much easier to reach with the different ways. So for instance, when we do a statewide North Carolina poll, we do some of the interviews by phone and some of the interviews over the internet, and we're much more likely to get certainly younger voters over the internet we're much more likely to get, but we're also much more likely to get African Americans or Latinos over the internet. So a lot of these sort of more Democratic leaning demographics are more likely to be, are more comfortable doing the online survey than doing the telephone survey, which has sort of been an interesting dynamic. So like when we put out a poll that says the governor's race is tied, McCrory will have been up by like 6 or 7 points with people who we interviewed over the phone, but then Cooper will be up by like 15 or 20 points with people we interviewed over the internet, because it's so much easier to get people in those sort of key Democratic demographics through internet interviews.
It's 12 after 1, and I really do want to be mindful of our time. I see 3 hands that I've got up still, and I'm going to go Rose Hogan.
Hey, Tom. First off, it's a question I've always wanted to ask. I don't know if you saw the piece I published this morning on the Medicaid expansion poll. And Jim Blaine, who's, for folks who don't know, he's Senator Berger's chief of staff, called you guys partisan Democrat hacks. How do or can one skew a poll? I mean, like, you know, obviously you folks have the reputation for being nonpartisan and sort of being accurate in your polling. You know, how does that end up happening? Is it all about how you ask the questions, or is it who you ask, or how does that end up, you know, changing polling?
So I have a lot of faith in the integrity of pollsters, and I don't think that just about anyone in the polling industry is intentionally trying to skew polls. But the kinds of things that can lead to differences in poll results is like how you project the makeup of the electorate. For instance, in 2012, there was a lot of attention to the fact that Gallup had Romney winning all year, while most of the rest of the polls had Obama winning. And the reason that Gallup had Romney winning was they said only 22% of the electorate was going to be non-white, and it ended up being 28%. And when you think about white voters voting Republican by 25 points, non-white voters voting Democratic by 70 points, that's the difference between having a poll where Romney's up or having a poll where Obama's up by 5. So they made incorrect demographic assumptions that ended up causing the polls to go in a more Republican manner. So it's stuff like that. It's like what percentage of different groups you have by age, by race, by gender. A lot of that kind of stuff has become sort of more of an art than a science because of the difficulties with getting people to respond to polls. You have to make a lot more assumptions about who's going to vote instead of just saying whoever answered the polls who's going to vote. If we just put out a poll just based on who answered it, and this is not a PPP specific thing, but everybody, Republicans would always be up by 15. Because let's think about it, here's who's more likely to answer polls. White people answer polls much more than African Americans and Latinos. Older people answer polls a lot more than younger people. So Republican-leaning demographics much more likely to answer polls than Democratic-leaning demographics. And that's why we have to do lots of math wizardry to get to something that's representative of the overall electorate. But that's how you get to things being, I don't think intentionally skewed, but if you're wrong in those assumptions, it can throw you off.
One question here, and then we're going to go to the gentleman in the middle and wrap it up.
I think I heard you say that McCrory's popularity turned down somewhere around July 2013, and you referenced the moral majority. Moral Monday, sorry. What was the connection there?
Well, I think that the Moral Monday movement, especially during the summer of 2013, was extremely effective in getting voters in the state to understand how extreme the General Assembly had gotten and how bad a lot of the things that they were doing were. And I think there had been an assumption that when McCrory got elected with all that sort of crossover support, that he would be a check on the General Assembly. And when he just sort of went along with everything they did and didn't stop what they did and that sort of thing, I think that was the point where a lot of voters said, okay, you're just a normal conservative Republican like all the rest of them. You're letting the legislature run amok. You're not strong enough to put a clamp down on what they're doing. And that was the point at which we saw his approval go from like 30 with Democrats down to 10, and it's never recovered. So it was the awareness that the Moral Monday movement brought about what was going on in the state that then sort of created this sense that McCrory had let things get out of control.
It's hard to remember, but there were lots of people in 2008 who had Obama and McCrory signs in their yard. Last question.
Well, this is kind of a two-part question.
Hold the microphone.
Yeah, so this kind of two-part question, which that in order for Democrats to do well, we need to do well in counties around Wake and Mecklenburg, and that we really need to, that's where we're weak. But the fact that's really popped out on me in Alter State is growing inequality and poverty that's creeping up to every county outside of Wake and Mecklenburg. How would this play into the politics in this country?
Sure. Well, I think it's really a situation where if progressives are going to be successful, they have to, I think, have to have a 100-county strategy. Certainly, you can build up a lot of support in Wake County and Mecklenburg County and that sort of thing, but what we saw, for instance, in the U.S. Senate election in 2014 is you can build up a huge margin in Wake and Mecklenburg County, but if you're letting yourself get blown out in all the smaller counties, that adds up really quickly, too. So I think that you speak to a situation where I think there are openings everywhere. You know, you might not win somewhere like Alamance County, but maybe you can lose it by 10 instead of losing it by 20 and that sort of thing. And that sort of incremental improvement across the board is, I think, the sort of thing that's going to happen for progressives to be successful statewide, is to not just completely rely on 15 counties or that sort of thing to really run up the score, because if you neglect the 85, it might not matter how much you ran up the score in those 15.
When I was writing the final chapter of Altered State, I got the fun task of writing something happy or something optimistic. And a lot of the ideas that I had came from some of the notions that Tom's been talking about today about the changing demographics of our state, how there is hope going forward. And so I hope you'll take that message as well as the fascinating news that Tom has shared with us today. He is obviously a great treasure for our state, so join me in thanking him again for this great work.